Okay, recording started. Thank you for joining us for Tech Tuesday. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the book Seven Powers, but this book tries to explain why some companies win against other companies. And the reason is because they have a moat, like a castle has a moat around it to stop people from coming in. And what I did in this slide is I made a list of all of the moats. That's in this one. And I asked which one does a startup have and which one does an incumbent, an existing company in the field have. And surprisingly or not surprisingly, except for counter positioning, which means that you start a company which does things so differently from an existing company that they can't make a similar offering. For example, Netflix gave you DVDs by mail and didn't charge you for bringing in DVDs late. And that was completely the opposite of the existing business model of, let's say, Blockbuster, which charged you for being late. And Blockbuster, they couldn't change how they were doing things. But in any case, if you look at this, and especially if you look at what's called cornered resource, which includes IP, well, the incumbent has more IP. So if you look at the slide, you must be asking yourself what I ask in the next slide. So why do startups succeed if existing incumbents have such wonderful moats? And I saw this quote by Jerry Newman, who says that the only moat that a startup can have that can create excess value is uncertainty. And here's another quote from Professor Wurzer of Strasbourg University, that IP is about creation of information asymmetries, and you get that with trade secrets, or you get exclusivity, and you get that with patents, perhaps. And the question you have to ask is, what kind of advantage does my business model have because of this asymmetry? The two problems with this. Problem number one, IP litigation is very expensive and takes a lot of time. So if you're a small startup, it's not likely that IP litigation will be, therefore IP, something that you can actually use directly. And regarding trade secrets, usually trade secrets are something created by a small number of people. And how long does it take a competitor to simply replicate the work of this small number of people? So I'm not going to talk today about super agility, that there's an opportunity and the startup can move in much faster than anybody else. It's not necessarily true. But in improv, when your co-actor says something, you say yes, and. So I'm going to say yes, and to the two quotes on the previous slide. And I'm going to note that startups change a lot over time. And they also have some natural asymmetries, which means that at different stages along the journey, a startup will have different natural moats. And the focus of what I'm going to talk about in the next, 15 minutes is how IP interacts with these asymmetries, which are not necessarily IP asymmetries, in order to help them, to build the asymmetries, to stoke them, to maintain them, to leverage them, most important, using them together with other business moves, and of course, to enhance the value of your startup. And all through this presentation, I want you to think about three archetypes of competitors that a startup might have. One of them is another startup in the same field, okay? A second one would be an incumbent, somebody who's in the field and owns the market. And the third one, I'm calling it a passerby with deep pockets. It's a different company. They have a lot of money, but they're not in the field. But if they suddenly decide this field is interesting, they might decide to put money into it. If you're lucky, they'll put the money in by buying you. And if you're unlucky, they'll put the money in by buying your competitor or by doing it all by themselves. In any case, each one of these archetypes has a different type of asymmetry with our startup company. So I selected the following asymmetries to talk about. There could be more, and not only there could be more, but it's your job as CEO and therefore also as patent attorney to identify which asymmetries are most important for your company. In any case, they are knowledge and exclusivity, which you saw in the quote before, personal risk, uncertainty, risk, momentum, cannibalism, network and scalability, and there could be more, which we're just not going to talk about. Most important is talking about risk and uncertainty. If you remember the quote from Jerry Newman, he said that the only moat that a startup has is uncertainty. And there's a problem that a lot of people conflate risk and uncertainty and say there's no difference between them. But there's a world of difference. Risk is something you can buy insurance for. Risk is something you can calculate. Okay, if I throw a coin, there's a risk of 50% it will come up heads. Well, 49.99, but a dragon can come by and swallow it in there. Things can happen. Uncertainty is when you can't. So when you're flipping a coin, you can say, the value of my bet is the amount times the probability of something happening. And that's why this quote from Frank Knight, who's a big proponent of it, is that a known risk will not lead to any reward or special payment at all. If there is a risk and we can quantify it, and by that we mean we know the distribution and we know the utility of each possible outcome, then there's no what you call risk to be taken. In startups, of course, that's exactly what doesn't happen. Let me explain. An incumbent has no problem insuring themselves against risk. We have a 50% risk of failing, so we do 2 of them. What that means, however, is that when we talk about risk, we want to use IP in order to make the cost of this insurance as high as possible. More important, we want to use IP to enhance uncertainty. And especially we want to enhance the possibility of a very high or maybe even uncapped downside. In other words, if you can lose everything, okay, a lot of people won't do that. And what I have here on the side is my cute hand-drawn colored graph showing the relationship between risk and uncertainty when you get a patent. Okay, so in the far left, we just filed it. When the competitor looks at the patent, the risk is low, but the uncertainty is high. As time goes on during prosecution, the risk goes up a little bit, and the uncertainty goes down because you know what patent is more likely to be granted. And then suddenly your patent is granted. At this point, the uncertainty goes down a lot. Okay, because we have enough lawyers that know how to calculate, even have infringement insurance, can calculate. It's not perfect. That's why there's still uncertainty. What went up is a risk. At the beginning, it goes up more, and then the risk goes down a little bit, and then it goes up again. It depends on who's copying and what's happening with technology. If you file a continuation or divisional in other countries, at grant, what happens is that the risk goes up again. I'm sorry, so uncertainty goes up again. Why does uncertainty go up? Because again, your competitor doesn't know if you're going to get what you asked for or if you're not going to get what you asked for. So one of the reasons for filing a divisional application is because the minute you have grant, you lost most of your moat of uncertainty. And by filing this divisional, you build it up again. And of course, you're going to file more than one patent and so on. Problem with risk and uncertainty is that we're fighting nature itself. Why? The very reason why startups exist is in order to reduce uncertainty and also maybe to increase upside, but I'm ignoring that. And in particular, we're reducing the uncertainty of the distribution of outcomes and the utility. So what we're also doing is we're quantifying risk. So what we're doing is we're taking uncertainty. A startup is a machine that takes uncertainty and generates risk. That is a job of a startup. And not only is it their job, but in order for the startup to continue existing, to raise money, they have to talk about it. They have to say, successful experiment, we cured 5 people of cancer. Okay, before that, nobody knew if you could cure people from cancer. Now we know that you can cure, and the question is, how likely is it that your drug will actually work? Well, we have statistics. We know what to expect. So when you have a startup, your uncertainty moat, which is not related to IP, will naturally dissipate over time, which means, obviously, that we want to use IP to build a new mode of uncertainty. Now, a very interesting trick of fate, how much the uncertainty is going down and how much risk is actually involved is a trade secret. Okay? If people don't know how much risk is involved, they might decide not to go in. But if they know that you're flipping a coin and the risk is 50%, they're going to go in. How much the uncertainty went down, again, tells people how big your moat is. If people know that you have a small moat, they rush in. If you have a big moat, they don't. You know the answers, they don't. It gives value to your company, people. It's a trade secret. In any case, there's a dilemma here that we're trying to keep the uncertainty moat, but we can't keep it. So one of the things to think about is deception activities. And the goal of deception activities is to convince a competitor that there's a lot of uncertainty, that there's a lot of risk, while you knowing that there isn't. And like most deception activities, if you know who it is you want to deceive, you can do them better. One day I'll give a talk about that. Talk for a second about trade secrets. So trade secrets can simply increase the risk. Let's say I did an experiment and I discovered the magic ratio between oil and sugar and vinegar, which makes a delicious candy. That's risk, because anybody can now do a known number of experiments and expect to get the answer. A different kind of trade secret increases uncertainty. Let's say I have some sort of magical effect. I turn water into oil. Nobody knows which chemical I'm using. The effect is magical. Nobody knows how to approach it. There's a big uncertainty if they'll ever be able to copy it. And one way of increasing uncertainty is taking a small problem and making sure that it looks big. So I was told a story by somebody who developed a machine. And he said, we built a machine and we realized that signal to noise would be a big problem. And Then we saw that our competitor had a patent on the only way to improve signal to noise. And we spent a whole year trying to design around the patent. And we couldn't. And then we decided we just won't put in any noise reduction circuit. He said, and guess what? It wasn't needed. Okay, so this fact that noise reduction was not needed is a trade secret. And imagine the value. It delayed the competitor by a whole year. Now, some trade secrets don't increase risk and don't increase uncertainty. For example, forgive me, some of you listening, the secret formula used in Coca-Cola. A lot of the value has to do with show. Anybody can make a formula and say, I tested it on people coming off the airplane, and they couldn't tell the difference between the old formula and the new formula. And in fact, they even prefer my new formula. Okay? And that's what Pepsi did. Once you brand, and startups usually don't brand early, then the value of this type of trade secret increases because this trade secret is supporting the brand. Now, reminding you that the very existence of some trade secrets is a secret. The problem is that if people don't know about it, it doesn't have the psychological effect of uncertainty. So it's a little dilemma. In general, if the trade secret doesn't need a lot of work to overcome or doesn't need to be overcome and is certain to be overcome, then the trade secret probably does not have a lot of value. Here's a little note about timing. Okay, I said before that the whole issue of the moat is time dependent. So in general, the company time and the market time, the IP time, the different event need to be synchronized. Classic example, your investors probably want to see scary intellectual property, and they want to see it long before the company can actually use the IP, long before they have the money and the power to do it. Another type of timing is timing to external events. If you know when your competitors are making decisions and what their OODA, type of decision-making loop, they use, you can time your bursts in uncertainty to when they need to make a decision. Let's say your competitor has to decide if to go into your field or not. And a week before the board meeting, an experiment publishes which says, people, it doesn't work. Okay? Well, good chance that the board will decide not to go into it. Guess what? 2 weeks later, you publish, different results. One thing to remember about timing is that as the time is not on our side, as the market develops, the payoff for competing goes up. So a competitor, it's more worthwhile for them to take a risk or leap of faith. Okay, when the market's little, no. When the market's big, and this is somewhat related to having less uncertainty on the outcomes. Now, in general, we've seen that an incumbent or a passerby with deep pockets can do any particular task faster than a startup if they want to. Wanting to mean they have to start it, and it also means that if there's results, they have to follow up. So if you're lucky, your incumbents and passerbys don't want to, or you can keep them from wanting to. Okay, knowledge. You noticed I talked about trade secrets before when I talked about uncertainty and risk, but you have knowledge and you have wisdom, and that is naturally protected using trade secrets. The problem with knowledge, and we see it quite often, is that as a startup, you have to meet with all sorts of strategic players, be they VCs or competitors, or And you have to convince them to be interested in you. And the way you do that is by imparting some of your knowledge or some of your insights. Okay, so I can't tell people not to do it, but I can tell people to be aware of it. And, usually it takes time, but often when you have a meeting like this, that's what you want to do. You want to convince people to change their mind. If you have knowledge, you need your employees to be aware what the knowledge is and why it's secret and in what way it's secret. And some of your secrets are so secret that not all of your employees should be aware of them. In order to keep a knowledge asymmetry, you can think about deception using publications. When you publish things, it can dilute your knowledge or send people's attention somewhere else. I talked about knowledge, but know-how and all of its related things like data and insights need to be very tightly controlled. And of course, when the time comes, often, not always, you're going to want a patent. Sometimes you're going to want a patent in order to hide the trade secret because people say they patented it, it can't be a trade secret. Okay, so effectively, it's a secret that anybody can see, but they don't believe in it. Or you can use it to highlight. Sometimes when you read a patent, you realize that there's a missing step. The steps that gets you from 10% yield rate to 99% yield rate. And you can do that with a patent. And one of the reasons you want to do it is because you want people to buy your technology from you. And if people are aware that it's more difficult to copy because you have a trade secret, they're more likely to buy. Exclusivity. Naturally, we do it with patents. Naturally, we do it in order to exclude competitors. Not always. Okay, it's not the only thing we do with patents. How much exclusivity depends on can we enforce? But if we're lucky, the structure of the market points out some particular weak link. And if we target that weak link, we can perhaps get what we want. You can use IP in order to encourage your competitors to choose other solutions. And sometimes it means you have to remind the markets that you have good IP on something. And then the competitors might go into the market and compete with you, but at least they won't be competing head to head. If you have patents, you can enhance your exclusivity, for example, by getting a monopoly on suppliers rather than on the product. And there's a link here at the bottom that you can read, which talks about how decreasing the asymmetry can also have value for your company. I'm not going to go into it, just you should be aware, talk about asymmetry, it doesn't have to be. Personal risk. Okay, the people you're competing with are not companies, they're people. Okay, these entities are people, and it's people with jobs. And startups are expected to fail. I mean, your investors won't tell you, but startups, don't usually succeed. Uh, People with jobs and stable companies want to keep their job, which means that somebody else is going to second guess every single decision they make, which means that they react, I'll call it less rationally, but for them it's just as rational, to uncertainty. You can use your IP to put a spotlight on what a big mistake could look like. Okay, so for example, let's talk about should the big company choose a design which infringes multiple patents and needs multiple trade secrets? If you do a plain calculation of risk, the answer would be, yeah, it's a $1 billion market and the infringement lawsuits have a 80% chance of failing and would only cost $20 million. That's a no-brainer, and that's what Samsung did with Apple. It was more than those amounts. So, but the person making the decision, they don't look at it that way. They look at it at Will I be the person who made this gutsy decision with this huge risk? No, I don't want to do that. You can use IP surprises, and people do it all the time by saying, oh, we just got a patent, okay, in order to highlight this personal risk. Of course, the risk profile depends on the individual. Elon Musk is not affected by this kind of thing, and it depends on the company itself, and it also depends on the availability of safer alternatives. So what you usually want to do is you want to make sure that the decision maker in the competitor has a bad decision and an okay decision. Like people used to say, you never get fired for buying IBM. So make sure that they can buy IBM. Sometimes you do that by getting IP and giving a license. Momentum and cannibalism. Think about Kodak. Kodak invented the digital camera, but they couldn't figure out how to make money on it without destroying the existing product lines, which were selling films. IP publications can highlight this cannibalism. Oh, we won't need any maintenance anymore. Okay. And of course, you want to keep secret any hint that there is no actual cannibalism, that it is actually a different market. A passerby or a different startup, they don't care about it. Momentum, think in judo. I talked before about helping your competitor make the right decision. So we can use IP to give just another little shove. Okay? So they can say, oh, let's continue with what we're doing. And you have to keep secret any data that suggests that they should change. Okay, you have a company, they know they have to change one day. As long as you fool them into thinking that it's not so important to change now, it'll take a while. And if you encourage people to believe the change is different, you can maintain this asymmetry. Now, this is all I'm talking about using IP to do it with a little bit of exclusivity, a little bit of licensing, a little bit of publication, a little bit of trade secrets, and so on. Networks and scaling. A lot of the startups we know, like Facebook, rely on network effects. And you want to use IP to interfere with the network effects of others. And you have to ask yourself which of the types of IP you know of can be used in time to interfere with the network effect. Another possibility is simply to steal somebody else's network effect and prevent them from doing it using IP. Very closely related to network effect from this perspective is a growth machine. What makes your company grow? What makes a competitor's company grow? Find out how to use IP to interfere with other companies' growth machine. And remember that an incumbent is different because they already have the market. They already have a network. They don't need to grow. They're more into switchover. They have to ask themselves, how do we take my clients that are used to buying a product and make them into subscribers? So I'm summarizing all of this. Here's a type of asymmetry that I talked about. And how does it look vis-a-vis a different startup, an incumbent, or a passerby with money? And the flat face means nah. The sad face means not good, and the happy face means good. For us, of course. So just for example, a different startup, they don't care about risk any more than you do. I'm, oversimplifying. An incumbent at the beginning will care about risk. Later on, the market appears better, they're going to care less, and later on, you're going to be bigger, and the risk will go up again. You can look at this at home. Just an example of what a task can look like. So we have a client that believes it can develop some product. Actually, I just saw a press release saying that they did it. But as an IP manager, you have to identify the strongest asymmetries. Maybe the CEO will tell you. For each one, you have to figure out what events, not necessarily IP events, are going to weaken it. And then for each one, we have to figure out how IP can strengthen that asymmetry. And of course, it's possible that over time, the company needs different asymmetries. The bonus, of course, is if you can figure out how to use IP to leverage one of these asymmetries into a complete business model. Okay, so I am stopping the recording now.